It started like any other Sunday morning. The air was calm. The lake was still. I was sipping my coffee when I saw her. My daughter-in-law, standing at the edge of the dock. She looked around, then tossed a suitcase straight into the lake. At first, I froze. I thought maybe it was trash, maybe clothes, but something felt wrong. Days later, when that same suitcase floated back to the surface, what I found inside shocked me. It changed everything I thought I knew about my family. This isn't just a story about what was hidden. It's about the truth that refuses to stay buried. So stay till the end, because when you find out what the lake was really keeping, you'll understand why forgiveness isn't always the ending. Sometimes it's the beginning. The sun hung low over the lake, glinting off the ripples like scattered glass. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds called from somewhere behind me, but I hardly heard them. My eyes were fixed on the figure at the end of the dock.
It was my daughter-in-law.
Her hands clutched a large, dark suitcase. For a moment, she stood still, her body tense, like she was arguing with herself. Then, without hesitation, she heaved the suitcase into the air. It hit the water with a deep splash that echoed across the lake. My stomach turned. I felt a strange chill crawl up my arms despite the warm air. Why would she throw something like that into the lake? I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. The wooden boards creaked under my shoes. She looked around fast, as if she sensed someone watching. Then she hurried back to her car parked near the trees. Gravel crunched beneath her tires as she drove away. Silence settled over the water again, broken only by the soft lapping of waves. I stared at the widening circles on the surface where the suitcase had sunk. Something inside me whispered to leave it alone. But curiosity is a powerful thing. I found myself stepping off the dock, slipping into the rowboat tied nearby. The oars dipped into the cold water with heavy rhythm. When I reached the spot, the lake looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. Beneath the surface, a faint shadow drifted, dark and shapeless. My pulse quickened. I leaned over, gripping the edge of the boat, trying to see clearer. The water was murky, but something pale flashed beneath. My breath caught. It looked like fabric. A hand? I reached down with the oar, pushing the surface aside, heart hammering in my chest. The suitcase bobbed up slightly, just enough for me to grab it. It was heavier than I expected, water pouring from its seams. When I dragged it toward me, a smell rose from it, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Blood. The smell hit stronger. Copper and decay mixed with the thick scent of lake water. My fingers trembled as I unlatched the case. Each click echoed like thunder in the quiet air. The lid creaked open, and for a moment, my mind refused to understand what I saw. Inside was a bundle of soaked fabric, a floral dress. The one I had given her last Christmas. It clung to something solid beneath. I pulled the fabric aside and a photo slipped out, sticking to my wet hands. It was my late husband, smiling, arms around me, taken on the same dock years ago. My throat tightened. Why would she throw this away? I lifted another item, a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were swollen with water, the ink running like tears. I could barely make out my name written across the cover. I froze. It was my journal, the one I had lost months ago. My heartbeat turned loud in my ears. She had been inside my room. She had taken it. I flipped through the pages, my words now smudged and bleeding into each other. But one page stood out, untouched by the water. Her handwriting, not mine. She had written across my own words. "You do not deserve what he left behind." My breath hitched. The suitcase was not just filled with memories. It was filled with everything that tied me to him. Photos, letters,
Keepsakes.
every piece of my past, gone, sunk beneath this lake. I felt my chest tighten, anger and disbelief swirling inside me. Why would she do this? Was it jealousy? Hatred? Fear that I still carried him in my heart. The sun dipped lower, turning the water gold and red. It looked peaceful again, almost beautiful, mocking me. I stared at the open suitcase, tears mixing with the lake's chill on my skin. Somewhere behind me, A car door slammed. Footsteps. I turned slowly. She was standing at the edge of the dock again. Her eyes met mine, calm, cold, and unflinching. Neither of us spoke. The wind carried the smell of wet pine and gasoline. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "I thought you would find it," she said softly. The sound of her voice made my blood run cold. Her voice broke the silence, like a match in a dark room. I gripped the edge of the boat, my knuckles pale, water dripping from my sleeves. "Why?" I asked. My voice came out rough, trembling, almost foreign to me. She took a step closer, the wooden dock creaking beneath her shoes. The calm in her eyes was more terrifying than anger. "You never let him go," she said quietly. "Even after he died. You kept him alive in every picture, every story, every word. It was like you wanted him more than I ever could." My heart twisted. "That is not true," I whispered. "He was my son." She laughed, short, sharp, bitter.
No.
"He was mine." The words cut deeper than the lake's cold air. Her gaze shifted to the open suitcase floating near me. "You wrote about me," she continued. "In that journal. You said I would never understand him. You said I was not good enough." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "I wrote that when I was angry," I said. "I lost him too. You were all I had left of him." For a second, her face softened, a flicker of pain behind the fury. But it vanished as quickly as it came. She knelt, her reflection trembling in the water beside her. "Do you know what it feels like," she said, her voice shaking now, "to live in someone else's shadow? To have every memory compared to a ghost?" I stared at her, realizing the years of silence, the dinners filled with polite smiles and buried resentment. The distance had not grown overnight. It had built like dust on old photographs. She looked up, tears glistening but refusing to fall. "When he died, I thought I would finally be free from your eyes. But you still looked at me like I had taken him from you." The truth hit hard. Maybe I had. Maybe I had clung to what little was left of him, too tightly, too painfully, until she felt trapped by it. "I am sorry," I said softly. "I never wanted you to feel that way." The lake was quiet again. The sky above turned orange and purple, clouds heavy with evening. She stood, brushing her wet hands against her jeans. "It is too late," she murmured. "Some things do not float back to the surface once they sink." She turned and started to walk away. My chest ached. My hands were still wet and cold, clutching the suitcase like it could anchor me to something real. "Wait," I said. She stopped.
Please.
"Whatever anger you have toward me, do not let it destroy him too." Those memories were all we had left. She hesitated, the wind lifting her hair. Then she whispered, "That is exactly why I had to let them go." Her car door slammed again, and within seconds, she was gone, leaving tire tracks in the damp dirt and a storm in my heart. I sat there as the lake swallowed the last light of day. The water rippled gently, carrying pieces of my past beneath its calm surface. For the first time, I realized it was not just the suitcase that had been thrown away. It was years of grief, misunderstanding, and silence, all the words we never said. I watched until the ripples faded, the water turning to glass. And somewhere in the reflection, I saw not just loss, but guilt staring back at me. I had spent so long trying to hold on to the dead that I had forgotten the living. The air grew cold. The crickets started to sing. And I sat there, alone with my memories, wondering if forgiveness could still rise, even from the deepest part of the lake. Her words echoed long after her car disappeared down the dirt road. The stillness felt heavy, pressing against my chest as the lake swallowed the last of the light. I sat in the boat, soaked, shaking, staring at the open suitcase. The smell of rust and wet paper lingered in the air. Somewhere, a loon cried across the water, a lonely sound that cut through the silence. I rowed back slowly, each pull of the oar sinking me deeper into thought. The sky had turned silver blue, the kind of color that belongs to endings. By the time I reached the shore, my arms ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I dragged the suitcase onto the grass, my shoes sinking into the soft mud. Every sound seemed too loud. The crunch of gravel, the whisper of the wind through the reeds, the beating of my heart. Inside my house, everything felt foreign. The photos on the walls smiled at me with a kind of cruel innocence. His face, my son's, looked so full of life, frozen in time. The same smile she had fallen in love with. I sank into his old chair by the window, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave. I could almost hear him, his laugh, his voice, the way he used to say, "Mom, it's just a bad day, not a bad life." But life had gotten bad. It had twisted itself into something unrecognizable. The clock ticked, steady and loud. I reached for the notebook again. Its pages were warped, some stuck together, others torn. But one page near the back caught my eye, a note in her handwriting. "Forgive me before it is too late." My breath caught. What did that mean? Had she known I would come here today? Had she wanted me to find this? I grabbed my coat and keys, heart pounding, and stepped outside. The evening air was colder now, and the sky was bruised with streaks of violet and gray. Her house was only a few miles away, down the old country road lined with pine and mailboxes. By the time I pulled into her driveway, her car was still warm, engine ticking softly. The front door was half open. I pushed it slowly. Inside, the living room was dark except for a single lamp glowing near the couch. On the table sat another suitcase, dry, clean, zipped tight. Next to it lay a framed photo of my son, the same one she had thrown into the lake. My throat tightened. Beside the frame was a letter with my name written in bold, shaking letters. I opened it, the paper trembling between my hands. "Everything I did to let go," it began. "He would not leave me alone. I saw him everywhere, in dreams, in shadows, in your eyes. The only way to make the noise stop was to throw away what tied us both to him. I never wanted to hurt you, but I was drowning." My knees weakened. I sank to the floor. The house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat echo. She had been suffering, not cruel, not heartless, just broken in a way I had never seen. Grief had different faces, and hers had worn the mask of anger. The lake had not just taken things. It had taken her peace. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter resting in my lap, tears sliding down my face. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and rain began to fall, tapping softly on the roof, like the lake had followed me home. When I finally looked up, my reflection stared back from the dark window. Tired, haunted, but not angry anymore. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who took my son, but as the woman who loved him enough to lose herself trying to let him go. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back beside the photograph. The storm outside grew louder, washing the dirt from the world. And as thunder rolled across the sky, I whispered into the empty room, "I forgive you." The words felt heavy, yet somehow they made the air lighter. But deep down, I knew this story was not over. Because sometimes forgiveness is not the end. It is only the beginning of what comes next. The next morning, the rain had washed the night clean. Fog rose from the lake in slow ribbons, wrapping the trees in soft gray. I stood at the water's edge, the ground still damp beneath my shoes. The world was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. The suitcase had vanished, swallowed by the lake's calm surface. But something had changed. A shimmer broke through the mist, small but distinct, near the dock. I stepped closer, my heart beginning to pound again. There, tangled among the reeds, was something pale, a piece of fabric, caught against a broken branch. I knelt, brushing it free with trembling fingers. It was his shirt, the one he wore the day before the accident. The one I had folded and packed away after the funeral. How did it end up here? A cold rush went through me, sharper than the morning air. I looked back toward the dock, and for the first time, I noticed the footprints, hers, pressed deep into the wet earth. They led to the water's edge and stopped. No return prints. The silence grew heavier. The lake rippled slightly, as if stirred by something beneath. I whispered her name, but the fog swallowed my voice. I waited, but nothing answered. Then, faintly, the sound of a splash not far out, slow and deliberate. A shape broke the surface, a glint of metal. The suitcase. It had surfaced again. My breath caught as I waded into the water, each step sending ripples across the reflection of the sky. The cold bit through my jeans, through my skin, straight to the bone. When I reached it, the lid had cracked open. Inside was a single item, the framed photo.
Clean. Dry.
Perfectly preserved. It should have been ruined, but it wasn't. Her handwriting now glowed faintly across the glass, written with a trembling finger before she threw it in. You cannot let go until I do. I froze. My hands trembled as I held it close. The water lapped around me, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. And for a moment, I swore I saw her reflection behind mine, standing on the dock, smiling softly through the fog. Not angry, not broken, just free. The wind shifted, carrying her scent, lavender and rain. My tears blended with the lake water as I whispered her name again. But this time, it was not out of fear or sorrow. It was forgiveness. And as I stood there, soaked and trembling, I realized something I had not before. Grief does not end. It changes shape. It hides in reflections, in empty chairs, in lakes that hold more secrets than truth. But forgiveness is what lets the living breathe again. I turned toward the shore, clutching the photo against my chest. Behind me, the lake rippled once more, then stilled, calm, silent, and endless. The fog began to lift, sunlight spilling across the water like gold. And for the first time since losing them both, I felt the warmth. Not from the sun, but from something deeper. Something that told me I was finally allowed to let go. A week later, the sky over the lake was clear again, too blue, too peaceful, as if it did not remember. The house was quieter than ever. Every sound echoed, the kettle's whistle, the ticking clock, the floorboards sighing beneath my steps. Grief has a way of stretching time, making each second feel like a lifetime. But that morning, something was different. I found myself standing by the kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hands, looking out toward the trees where the light filtered through. I could see the path leading down to the lake, the place that had taken so much and, somehow, given something back. I walked outside. The air smelled of earth and lilac, and the wind carried the faint hum of distant cars from the main road. Life going on, indifferent and unstoppable. I passed the mailbox at the end of the drive. Inside was a single envelope. No return address. No stamp. Just my name. My fingers shook as I tore it open. Inside was a photograph, one I had never seen before. My son, standing beside my daughter-in-law, both smiling wide, sunlight catching their faces. They were standing by the same lake. On the back, in her handwriting, were 4 words. He forgave us both. My knees weakened. The world blurred as tears welled up. I held that photo against my chest like it was proof that peace could still exist. For the first time in years, I felt him close, not as a ghost haunting the corners of my home, but as a presence urging me to live again. The next day, I packed a basket with flowers, wild ones from the field behind the house. I walked down to the lake slowly, the way you walk through a dream. The dock creaked beneath me as I laid the flowers at the edge, watching them drift out across the still water. They floated together in small clusters, carried by the breeze toward the center, where the water glowed with sunlight. And as I stood there, something inside me loosened.
It was not joy.
It was not relief. It was something deeper, the quiet release that comes when you stop fighting the past. The weight in my chest, the bitterness, the questions, they all began to fade. I whispered their names into the air, not as a plea,
Not as a goodbye.
but as a thank you, because sometimes the people who break you are the ones who also teach you how to rebuild. The wind picked up again, swirling through the trees. I could almost hear laughter, soft, distant, familiar. And in that sound, I found peace. I looked back toward the house, small against the horizon, the white paint catching the morning light. For the first time, It felt like a home again, not a tomb of memories. I smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because I knew I could finally live without fear of forgetting. I turned to leave, the sunlight warm on my face, and as I did, I caught one last glimpse of the lake. The flowers had formed a shape, two circles touching, drifting side by side. A sign, maybe. Or just the wind. Either way, it was enough. And with that, I walked away, leaving the ghosts to rest and the water to keep its secrets. A few months passed. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the small lakeside town in shades of amber and gold. The tourists were gone now, and only the locals remained, the ones who knew every creak of the docks and every secret the water kept. I had started to walk into town again. At first, it felt strange. The grocery store, the post office, the coffee shop by the corner, they had all stayed the same, but I had changed. People noticed. "Good to see you out again, Martha," old Mr. Jenkins said as he handed me my mail. I smiled, and for once it was real. Grief had not left me, but it had softened, turned into something quieter, almost kind. Every morning I still went down to the lake. Not to cry, not to remember, but to listen. The sound of the water, the whisper of wind through the pines, it felt like they spoke now. Not in words, but in forgiveness. Then, one day, I received an invitation from the local community center. They were hosting a small event, a storytelling evening called Voices of the Lake. The flyer read, "Share your story. Someone may need to hear it." For days, I left the paper on the kitchen table, unsure. My hands would hover over it, but my heart hesitated. What could I possibly say that would matter? But one night, as I sat by the fire with that same photograph in my lap, I realized the story had never been about losing them. It was about finding myself again. So I went. The community hall was warm and full of life, candles on tables, the smell of apple pie and coffee in the air. People from town sat in folding chairs, their faces kind and expectant. When it was my turn, my knees trembled as I walked up to the small wooden stage. The microphone hummed softly. For a moment, I could not speak. Then I looked at the faces before me, strangers, friends, neighbors, and I began. "I once saw my daughter-in-law toss a suitcase into the lake," I said. A few heads lifted, eyes curious. I thought it was hatred. I thought it was meant to hurt me. But I learned that sometimes what we throw away is not anger, it is pain. The room went still. I spoke of the day I found the suitcase, of the smell of the lake, of the words she left behind. I spoke of forgiveness, how it does not come in one moment, but in hundreds of small ones. And when I said her name out loud, for the first time in so long, my voice did not break. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap, slow at first, then steady, warm, real. A few people had tears in their eyes. Afterward, a young woman approached me. Her eyes were red, her hands clutching a tissue. "My mom passed last year," she said softly. "I've been angry at her for leaving. But listening to you, I think I can start forgiving her." I took her hand and squeezed it gently. "That's the hardest part," I said. "But it's also the one that saves us." She smiled, small, fragile, but full of hope. That night, as I walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, the air was cool, and the stars shimmered above the lake like tiny candles. I could almost feel them both beside me, my son and his wife, walking quietly at peace. When I reached my porch, I turned back one last time. The lake gleamed in the distance, calm and endless. And I whispered, "Thank you." Because grief had not broken me. It had rebuilt me. And in sharing it, I had found something I thought I had lost forever: connection. The kind that only comes from truth, pain, and love that refuses to die. By the next spring, word of her story had spread far beyond the little lakeside town. Someone from the local newspaper had been in the audience that night at the community center. A week later, my phone began to ring. Local journalists, radio hosts, even a college in another state that wanted me to speak. At first, I laughed it off. I was just an old woman who had lived through too much and learned too late. What could I possibly say that people wanted to hear? But letters began to arrive. From people who had lost their children, their parents, their spouses. People who had stood by hospital beds, gravesides, and empty rooms, trying to understand how to live with what they could not change. They wrote, "Your story made me call my sister again. It helped me forgive my father. It reminded me that love does not die, it just learns to speak softer." I cried over every one of them. For the first time, the lake was no longer a wound. It had become a mirror, reflecting what we all shared.
Grief. Regret.
And the need to let go before life slips past us. Months later, I found myself sitting under bright lights in a small studio in Chicago. A young woman named Emily, a podcast host, leaned across the table with kind eyes and asked, "Why did you decide to tell this story?" I smiled, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. "Because silence," I said, "is heavier than grief. It keeps you trapped in the same moment forever. And when you finally speak, you let the light back in." Emily's eyes shimmered. She nodded slowly, and for a few seconds, neither of us said a word. That episode aired a week later. It went viral. Millions listened. Comments flooded in, people saying they listened in their cars and cried. Couples who said they held hands tighter that night. Parents who said they went to hug their children. For the first time, I felt that my pain had turned into something that healed. One afternoon, I returned to the lake. The water was still, the sky reflected perfectly on its surface. Someone had left flowers near the dock, daisies and wild roses tied with a white ribbon.
There was a note tucked underneath.
In simple handwriting, it read, "For her, the woman who taught us all how to forgive." I stood there for a long time, the breeze tugging gently at my hair. The water shimmered, and for a heartbeat, I saw them again, my son and his wife, standing together at the end of the dock. He had his arm around her shoulders. She was smiling at me. Then the reflection broke, scattered by a gust of wind, and they were gone. But my heart was calm. The pain had softened into memory, the guilt into gratitude. I whispered one last time to the lake, "Thank you for taking what I could not carry, and for giving me back what I had forgotten, peace." Then I turned and walked toward the path home, the world around me alive again. The hum of crickets, the scent of pine, the warmth of sunlight on my skin. Because that is what healing feels like. Not a moment, not a miracle, but a quiet decision to keep walking, even when the past still calls your name. And as the wind rose behind me, carrying ripples across the lake, I finally understood. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without breaking. It means choosing to love again, even when it hurts. And that choice, that fragile, human choice, is what saves us all but a few years past. The story that had once been my private pain had turned into something far greater than I could have imagined. People still wrote to me, not just from my small town but from across the country. From New York to Montana. From small farms in Kansas to quiet coastal towns in Maine. Some wrote letters, others sent emails, but they all began the same way. "I saw your story online, and it felt like you were talking to me." I kept them in a wooden box beside the fireplace, hundreds of them, bound with a ribbon. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would open that box and read. Each letter was a different kind of ache. A soldier who lost his best friend. A mother who could not forgive her daughter. A man who had driven for hours just to scatter his father's ashes in silence. All of them searching for the same thing, peace. And somehow, through the pain I once wished I could erase, I had helped them find a little of it. I started volunteering at a local grief support center. The first time I spoke there, I stood in front of 12 folding chairs, a circle of faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. No cameras, no lights, just people holding their own invisible suitcases. I told them the truth, that forgiveness does not arrive like a storm. It comes like the first thaw after winter, slow, messy, but inevitable. I told them how I used to sit by that lake, waiting for answers that never came. How I thought letting go meant losing them forever. But I had learned something deeper. Letting go is not the same as forgetting. It is remembering without the pain consuming you. When I finished, no one clapped. They just sat there, breathing, listening, feeling. Then a woman across from me whispered, "I haven't cried in months, but I think I can now." That was the moment I realized this was what I was meant to do. Not to dwell on what I lost, but to help others carry what they could not. By the time autumn came again, I had turned my story into a small book, not for fame, not for profit, but for the people who needed a voice when theirs trembled. It was called The Lake Between Us. I dedicated it to my son and my daughter-in-law, to love that outlives its mistakes, to forgiveness that comes too late, but still comes. It found its way into churches, libraries, shelters, even classrooms. Teachers wrote to tell me that teenagers were reading it, learning that grief is not weakness. It is proof that we once loved deeply. And when the local TV station invited me to speak on Thanksgiving, I almost said no. But something inside me whispered, "Go." So I did. I sat in front of the camera, the same trembling hands that once clung to that suitcase, now resting calmly on my lap. The host asked, "If you could tell people one thing, one message from all of this, what would it be?" I smiled gently. "That love is louder than loss," I said. "And forgiveness is not a gift you give others, it's the gift you give yourself." The interview aired that night. I thought it would come and go, but it did not. Thousands shared it. Families gathered around their screens. People sat in living rooms, coffee shops, hospitals, crying, holding hands, calling people they had not spoken to in years. And somewhere in all that noise and healing, I realized something that brought tears to my eyes. The story that began with pain had ended as a bridge. A bridge between strangers who finally saw themselves in someone else's sorrow. The lake outside my window still looked the same, but it was not a place of loss anymore. It was a reminder that the water that once took so much had also given something back. Understanding. Sometimes I sit there at sunset, watching the sky turn gold and pink, and I whisper their names again. Not out of grief, but gratitude. I imagine them together, somewhere beyond the quiet surface, smiling at the woman I finally became. And in that stillness, I know, you do not move on from love. You carry it forward. It becomes the voice that steadies you when the world feels too heavy. It becomes the reason you keep living, not to forget, but to remember differently. And maybe, just maybe, that is what heaven really is. Not somewhere far away, but the moment you learn to forgive yourself and love again, even after everything you thought had drowned. A year later, something happened that I never expected. I received a letter with a golden seal from a film company in Los Angeles. They had found my book, The Lake Between Us, through a teacher's reading list in Oregon. One of their producers had lost his own mother recently and said my story made him see grief in color again. He wanted to bring it to life, on screen. At first, I did not know how to feel. The thought of actors, lights, and scripts seemed so far away from the quiet truth that had once belonged only to me, the lake, and the ghosts of my past. But I said yes, because I knew if one story could help a few hundred people, maybe a film could reach a few million hearts that still needed healing. When they came to film, they used the real lake. My lake. The one that had seen everything. Loss, forgiveness, rebirth. I stood behind the cameras that first morning of shooting. The mist hung low over the water, exactly the way it had the day she threw the suitcase in. The actress who played me stood there in silence, hands trembling just like mine had once done. When she turned to the director and said, "I am ready," my breath caught. It was no longer just my story. It was everyone's. The sound of the first scene, the splash of the suitcase, the echo of her voice, sent a chill through me. Not from sadness, but from recognition. It felt like the lake itself was watching, proud, patient, at peace. During filming breaks, I spoke with the crew. Some had lost their parents. Some had gone through divorces. Some had never been able to forgive themselves for what they left unsaid. Every person who worked on that movie carried a piece of grief. And together, we turned it into something beautiful. When the film premiered, they flew me out to Los Angeles. It was my first time seeing the ocean. It felt like the lake, bigger, louder, endless, as if my small story had been set free into something vast. The theater was packed. When the lights dimmed, I gripped the armrest, heart pounding. And there it was. The story of my son.
Of my daughter-in-law.
Of the lake. The audience was silent throughout. Not because they were bored, but because they felt it. When the credits rolled, no one moved right away. Then, slowly, a wave of applause rose. Not thunderous, but heavy with emotion. People stood. Some cried. Some hugged the strangers next to them. Afterward, a woman in her 50s came up to me, tears in her eyes. She said, "I lost my daughter 3 years ago. I thought I had nothing left to give. But after seeing this, I think I can start again." I took her hand. We did not need more words. That night, as I stood on the balcony of the hotel overlooking the city lights, I felt something shift inside me. The same grief that once drowned me had become the current that carried others to shore. I looked up at the stars and whispered, "We did it." And for a fleeting second, I felt them, my son and his wife, standing beside me. Not in sadness, but in quiet pride. The film went on to touch millions. People shared their own lake stories online, stories of loss, forgiveness, and the moments that broke them open. Hashtags filled with messages. Hashtag letting go. Hashtag forgive to heal. Hashtag the lake between us. A small-town widow's grief had become a movement of healing across America. And every time someone told me their story, I would listen, smile, and say, "Do not run from your pain. Sit with it. Listen to it. It is trying to tell you something." Years later, when the lake froze over one winter morning, I sat by the window with my tea, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the sunlight sparkle across the ice. The world outside was quiet again. But this time, it was not the silence of loss. It was peace. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the cup against my palms, and whispered softly, "Thank you for finding me through the pain." And somewhere beyond the frozen surface, beyond time itself, I knew they were home too. Because that is how love works. It does not end when people leave. It transforms. It flows. It finds its way back to you. Sometimes through tears, sometimes through stories, and sometimes through the water that remembers everything. And as the morning sun melted through the mist, I smiled, knowing the lake would keep whispering my story long after I was gone. Years later, the lake still shimmered beneath the same wide sky. The dock had been rebuilt, its wood smooth, freshly painted, but still creaking in the same familiar rhythm when the wind moved across it. The house nearby had new owners now, a young family who had moved in from the city. Every summer, their children played by the water, chasing dragonflies and skipping stones. And sometimes, when the evening light turned gold and the world went quiet, their mother would gather them around on a picnic blanket and tell them a story. Not a fairy tale, not something she made up, but a story that truly happened here. She would point toward the far end of the lake and say, "Once, right over there, a woman came to forgive the past." The children would listen wide-eyed, their small hands still clutching pieces of bread they had been tossing to the ducks. "She lost people she loved," their mother continued softly, "but she learned something powerful, that love never really leaves. It changes, but it never disappears." The youngest child would always ask the same question, "Is she still here?" And their mother would smile, her gaze resting on the glowing reflection of the sky across the water. "Yes," she would whisper, "just not the way you think." At the edge of the dock, the wind would ripple the surface, gentle, steady, almost like an answer. The family did not know that the woman who once stood here had left behind more than memories. She had left behind a story that had spread across towns, across states, a story that had healed strangers, softened hearts, and taught a nation that grief could become grace. Her book still sat on library shelves. Her voice still played in podcasts and documentaries. But more importantly, her truth had taken root in people who learned to forgive, to love, and to live again. And on quiet evenings, when the moon rose and the water turned silver, locals said they sometimes saw two figures standing at the edge of the dock, a man and a woman, their reflections shimmering side by side. They never spoke. They just stood there, together, watching the ripples fade into calm. The lake kept their secret, and the world kept their message. Because in the end, forgiveness was never about forgetting. It was about remembering with peace. And though time moved on, and seasons changed, one thing always remained. The lake still whispered, and it whispered her name. In every life, there is a lake, a place where pain meets peace, where love learns to breathe again. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let the water carry the rest.